Welcome to Brown Verses, a podcast where history, culture, identity, and truth come together. I'm Dr. Charles Ware, and I want to thank you for being here for the very first episode of this podcast. As a reminder, this space was created to highlight the history, culture, importance, and lived experiences of people of color. It was created to make room for stories that are often overlooked, voices that are too often unheard, and truths that deserve to be remembered. And for this episode, I want to begin with one word: erasure. Erasure is not always dramatic. It is not always loud. Sometimes it happens quietly. Sometimes it happens in textbooks. Sometimes it happens in media. Sometimes it happens in boardrooms, classrooms, workplaces, and even in everyday conversations. Sometimes erasure looks like being present, but never fully seen. Sometimes it looks like making contributions that are celebrated while the people behind those contributions are ignored. This is what I want us to sit with today. The question of, what does it mean to be erased? Erasure happens when people, communities, and contributions are pushed to the margins of the story. It happens when history is told without the full truth. It happens when narratives are shaped by people outside the community, while the people who live the experience are denied the chance to speak for themselves. It happens when culture is consumed, but the humanity behind that culture is dismissed. It happens when the presence of people of color is acknowledged only in fragments instead of in full. But erasure is not abstract. It has names, it has faces, and unfortunately, it has consequences. While we talk about erasure, we are not just talking about forgotten names. We are talking about people whose contributions helped shape history, while their stories were pushed to those margins we talked about earlier. We are talking about people like Sylvia Mendez, whose family helped challenge school segregation long before Brown versus Board of Education. We are talking about Larry Itilong, a Filipino-American labor leader whose role in organizing farm workers is too often overshadowed. And we are talking about Patsy Mink, the first woman of color elected to the United States House of Representatives, whose impact on education and public policy deserves far more recognition. But we're also talking about people like Anna May Wong, a groundbreaking actress who faced exclusion and misrepresentation, even as she helped define early American film. These are not side stories, these are American stories. And when these names are left out, what is erased is more than history. What is erased is context, contribution, and truth. That is why telling these stories matter. Erasure also happens in the stories we are taught to celebrate. We often learn polished versions of history that make progress seem simple, inevitable, and complete. But when the struggle is softened, when the resistance is simplified, and when the people who carried the burden are barely mentioned, history becomes less honest and far less human. The truth is that many communities of color did not simply appear in the story when the country is ready to acknowledge them. They were always there. They were there building, leading, creating, resisting, and surviving. The problem was never a lack of presence. The problem was a lack of recognition. For many communities of color, erasure is not just historical, it is ongoing. It happens when the stories we learn are incomplete. It happens when people know the music, the style, the slang, the flavor, the influence, but do not know the people. It happens when pain is minimized, the resilience is expected, and the brilliance is treated as an exception rather than a truth. And the impact of that kind of erasure runs deep. Because when people are erased, what is lost is not just information. What is lost is identity. What is lost is memory. What is lost is connection. And what is lost is dignity. When people do not see themselves reflected honestly in history, in leadership, in institutions, or in public life, it sends a message. It says that their story is secondary. It says that their contribution is optional. It says that their voice can be left out. But that is a lie. The truth is that people of color have always shaped this country. They've always shaped culture. They've shaped movements. They've shaped communities. And therefore, they've shaped the future. The problem is not absence. The problem is recognition. The problem is who gets centered, who gets remembered, and who gets reduced to a footnote. But erasure does not only live in textbooks or historical archives. It shows up in everyday life. It shows up in meetings where someone's ideas are ignored until they are repeated by someone else. It shows up in media when communities are reduced to stereotypes instead of full human complexity. It shows up in institutions that benefit from the labor, creativity, and resilience of people of color while still failing to fully see them. That kind of erasure can be very subtle, but it is powerful because over time, being overlooked sends a message. It tells people that their presence is acceptable, but their full humanity is optional. And that is a message we have to challenge. That is one of the reasons this podcast matters to me. Brown Versus is not just a title, it is a statement. It is about what we had to push against. It is about the forces that try to silence, flatten, stereotype, or erase the complexity of our experiences. It's also about confronting the distance between the truth of who we are and the narrow versions of us that are too often presented to the world. I created this podcast to push back. It is here to create space for fuller stories, honest stories, uncomfortable stories, proud stories, everyday stories, stories rooted in struggle, but also in joy, stories of resilience, but also of brilliance, stories of pain, but also of power. Because too often when communities of color are discussed, the conversation begins with oppression and it ends there. And while we must tell the truth about injustice, we might also tell the truth about creativity, leadership, love, innovation, family, legacy, and vision. We are more than what we survived. We are also what we built, what we carried, what we taught, what we protected, what we imagined, and what we passed on. That deserves language. That deserves record. That deserves witness. I think about how often people of color have had to fight not only to be included, but to also be understood, to be seen as fully human, to be recognized in our full complexity, not as symbols, not as trends, not as headlines, but simply as people. And that fight takes many forms. Sometimes it looks like preserving family stories that never made it into official history. Sometimes it looks like challenging systems that never expected us to lead. Sometimes it looks like naming harm that others would rather ignore. Sometimes it looks simply like telling the truth in spaces that are more comfortable with silence. And sometimes telling the truth is its own kind of resistance. Which brings us to the real question. What do we do about it? Reclaiming the story is more than an act of remembrance. It is an act of resistance. It is a decision to say that what was ignored still matters, what was distorted still deserves correction, and what was silenced still has voice. When we tell fuller stories, we do more than honor the past. We create a different future. We give people language for what they have experienced, connection to what came before them, and permission to see themselves as central, not secondary, to the story. This is why I wanted episode 1 to begin here. Before we get into specific communities, specific issues, specific stories, or specific guests, I wanted to start with a deeper question underneath all of it. who gets remembered, who gets heard, who gets credit, and who gets to define the narrative. Lastly, what happens when entire communities spend generations seeing themselves partially told, misrepresented, or missing from the story altogether? None of these questions are small questions, but they are questions about power, they're questions about memory, and they're questions about belonging. And those are exactly the kinds of questions we will explore on this podcast. On Brown Versus, we will talk about culture, we will talk about identity, we will talk about overlooked history, representation, leadership, community, and most importantly, truth. We will talk about what has been taken, what has been hidden, and what has been carried forward. Most importantly, we will always make room for voices, the real voices, personal voices, reflective voices, voices that can speak from experience, not just observation. Why do we do that? Because stories hit differently when they come from people who have lived them. So if you are listening today and you have ever felt unseen, unheard, underestimated, stereotyped, or reduced, this is the space for you. If you are listening and you care about history, culture, justice, and truth, this is the space for you. If you are listening because you know there is more to the story than what we have been given, this is the space for you. And if you are listening simply because you want to understand more deeply, think more honestly, and engage more meaningfully, this is the space for you, and you are welcome here too. My hope is that Brown Versus becomes more than a podcast. My hope is that it becomes a record, a mirror, a challenge, a conversation, a reminder that stories matter and that people inside those stories matter too. Erasure tells us what is missing is not important. This podcast says the opposite. This podcast says what will be overlooked still matters. What was silenced still has a voice. What was minimized still has weight. And most importantly, what was erased can still be reclaimed. This is where we begin, not where we end. Thank you for listening to episode 1 of Brown Versus. I'm Dr. Charles Ware, and this is Brown Versus, Stories That Push Back.